The Montana sky stretched endlessly above Jake Thompson as he guided his weathered pickup truck down the dusty county road. The autumn wind whipped through his rolled-down windows, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant cattle. At 42, Jake had spent more than half his life drifting from ranch to ranch, taking odd jobs and never staying long enough for anyone to get too familiar. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel as he squinted against the late afternoon sun, searching for the turn-off to the Henderson place where he'd heard they needed temporary help with fence repairs. The radio crackled with static between country songs, and Jake reached over to turn the volume down. He preferred the silence anyway. Conversation had never come easy to him, not since his father died when he was 16 and left him to fend for himself. The years had taught him that people were temporary, but the land and the work, those were constants he could rely on. As he rounded a bend, Jake spotted something that made him press the brake pedal. About a quarter-mile ahead, 3 horses stood clustered near a section of fence that had clearly seen better days. The animals were beautiful, a chestnut mare, a black gelding, and a paint horse with distinctive markings, but they were on the wrong side of the fence line, grazing freely on county road property. The wooden posts leaned at dangerous angles, and several strands of barbed wire lay tangled on the ground. Jake pulled his truck to the shoulder and killed the engine. He sat for a moment, studying the situation. The horses didn't appear distressed, but they were clearly lost, separated from their proper pasture. Through the broken fence, he could see a well-maintained ranch house in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney. Someone was probably worried sick about these animals. Stepping out of his truck, Jake felt the familiar ache in his left knee, a souvenir from a bull riding accident in his younger, more reckless days. The horses looked up at his approach, but didn't spook. The chestnut mare, obviously the leader, took a few steps toward him with curious brown eyes. "Easy there, girl," Jake murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He'd always had a way with horses, something his old mentor Bill Crenshaw used to say was a gift. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" The mare whickered softly, and Jake noticed the quality of her coat, the careful grooming, the expensive halter she wore. These weren't wild horses or neglected animals. Someone loved these creatures and was probably frantically searching for them. Jake walked along the fence line, assessing the damage. The break was extensive. At least 30 feet of fencing would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Storm damage most likely, though the wood showed signs of age and wear that suggested this had been an accident waiting to happen. He counted at least 6 posts that would need replacing, and the wire would have to be restrung completely. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him turn. A dust cloud announced the arrival of a blue Ford F-150, traveling fast down the ranch road on the other side of the fence. The truck screeched to a halt, and a woman jumped out, her face etched with worry. She was probably in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing well-worn jeans and boots that spoke of serious ranch work. Her green eyes scanned the horses quickly, relief flooding her features as she confirmed they were all present and unharmed. "Thank God," she breathed, then noticed Jake standing by the fence. "Are you the one who found them?" "Just got here myself," Jake replied, touching the brim of his worn cowboy hat. "Saw them from the road. They seem fine. Just took themselves on a little adventure." The woman approached the fence, and Jake could see the exhaustion in her movements. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is my property, and these are my horses. I've been looking for them for 3 hours." She ran a hand through her hair, dislodging a few strands from her ponytail. "I came back from town and found the pasture gate open and the fence down. I was terrified they'd wandered onto the highway." "Name's Jake Thompson," he said, then gestured toward the damaged fence. "Looks like this has been weakening for a while. The storm we had last week probably just finished what time started." Sarah nodded grimly, examining the destruction. "My husband usually handled all the fence repairs, but..." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I've been managing things on my own for the past year. I'm learning as I go, but I'm not great with construction work yet." Jake heard the unspoken story in her hesitation and the way her eyes briefly shadowed with grief. He'd seen that look before in people who'd lost someone important. The smart thing would be to help her get the horses back to safety and then continue on his way to the Henderson job. Getting involved in other people's problems was a complication he'd spent years avoiding, but something about the way Sarah looked at her horses, the obvious love and concern in her expression, reminded him of better times. Times when he'd believed in helping neighbors and being part of something larger than himself. "I've got some tools in my truck," Jake found himself saying, "and some fence posts and wire. I could help you get this patched up enough to get your horses home safe." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise and relief. "I couldn't ask you to do that. I don't even know you, and this isn't your problem." "You didn't ask," Jake replied simply. "I'm offering. These horses need to get back where they belong before dark, and that fence needs to be secure before more storms come through." The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass and carrying the scent of approaching weather. In the distance, dark clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, promising another autumn storm system moving through the Montana plains. Sarah studied Jake's face, perhaps trying to gauge his intentions or wondering what kind of man would stop to help a complete stranger. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Thompson, I accept your offer, but I insist on paying you for your time and materials." Jake shook his head. "Let's just focus on getting this done before the weather turns." As the two of them worked to guide the horses back through the gap in the fence and toward the barn, Jake found himself wondering what he was getting himself into. He'd planned to be at the Henderson place before sunset, but something about Sarah Mitchell and her small crisis had changed his priorities. Maybe it was the way she handled the horses with obvious skill and affection, or maybe it was simply that he recognized someone trying to keep things together in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Whatever the reason, Jake Thompson was about to break his own rule about staying uninvolved in other people's lives. The first drops of rain began falling, just as Jake and Sarah managed to secure the 3 horses in the barn. The chestnut mare, whom Sarah called Bella, had been particularly reluctant to leave the freedom of the open road, but Jake's patient coaxing had eventually won her over. The barn was warm and dry, filled with the comforting scents of hay and leather, and the horses settled quickly into their stalls with obvious relief. "That was close," Sarah said, brushing raindrops from her jacket as the sky opened up outside. Thunder rumbled overhead, and lightning flickered through the barn windows. "If we'd waited another 10 minutes, we'd all be soaked." Jake nodded, pulling his worn work gloves from his back pocket. "Storm's going to make the fence work more challenging, but that break needs fixing tonight. Your horses are smart enough to stay in the barn during bad weather, but come morning, they'll be looking for a way back to that sweet grass on the other side." Sarah glanced toward the barn doors, where rain was now coming down in earnest. "Are you sure we should work in this weather? It's getting pretty rough out there." "I've worked in worse," Jake replied, though he appreciated her concern. Most people he'd encountered over the years viewed hired help as expendable, expected to work regardless of conditions. "Besides, if we wait until tomorrow, you might wake up to find your horses halfway to town again." The truth was, Jake had been thinking about calling the Henderson place to postpone his arrival until morning anyway. Something about Sarah's situation had caught his attention in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the determined set of her shoulders as she'd handled the escaped horses, or the way she'd thanked him without the condescending tone he often heard from ranch owners who viewed him as just another drifter. "All right then," Sarah said, pulling on a heavy rain slicker. "But I'm helping. This is my fence, my responsibility." Jake started to protest. He was used to working alone, and most clients preferred to stay inside while he handled the manual labor. But something in Sarah's expression told him arguing would be pointless. She had the look of someone who'd learned to stand her ground out of necessity. They made several trips to Jake's truck, gathering fence posts, wire, tools, and a portable generator he'd invested in years ago for jobs like this. The rain made everything more difficult, turning the ground muddy and slippery, but Sarah proved to be more capable than many ranch hands he'd worked with. She knew how to handle the wire without getting tangled, could sink a post hole with proper technique, and didn't complain about the increasingly miserable conditions. "You've done this before," Jake observed as they worked to set the first replacement post. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, and his flannel shirt was soaked through despite his jacket. "My husband Tom taught me," Sarah replied, steadying the post while Jake tamped earth around its base. "He always said a rancher needed to know every aspect of the operation, not just the parts that seemed pleasant or easy." Her voice carried a mix of pride and sadness that made Jake glance at her more closely. "Sounds like a smart man." He was. Sarah wiped rain from her face with the back of her glove. "Car accident last winter. Black ice on Highway 12. She said it matter-of-factly, but Jake caught the slight tremor in her voice. "Left me with 800 acres, 30 head of cattle, and these 3 horses that think they're escape artists." Jake felt the familiar urge to change the subject, to retreat into the comfortable distance he usually maintained with clients. Personal stories led to connections, and connections led to complications he'd spent years avoiding. But something about working alongside Sarah in the storm, both of them focused on the same goal, made conversation feel natural rather than intrusive. "That's a lot of responsibility for one person," he said carefully. "It is," Sarah agreed, moving to help him position the next post. "Some days I wonder if I should sell and move back to town. My sister keeps telling me I'm being stubborn, trying to hold on to something I can't manage alone." The rain intensified, drumming against their jackets and turning the ground into a muddy mess. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by thunder that made the horses whinny nervously in the barn. Jake found himself thinking about his own stubborn choices over the years, the way he'd refused help or connection, even when it might have made his life easier. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, and Jake realized she was genuinely interested in his opinion, not just making conversation. "I think," Jake said, stretching a strand of barbed wire between posts, "that people who don't live this life don't understand what it means to walk away from it. Land gets into your blood. Once it does, town living feels like wearing clothes that don't fit." Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd met her, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "That's exactly how Tom used to put it. He'd say the ranch wasn't just where we lived, it was who we were." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their labor creating an unexpected sense of partnership. Jake found himself appreciating Sarah's competence and determination. She didn't chatter nervously or ask constant questions, but she was observant, learning his methods and anticipating what tool or material he'd need next. By the time they finished stringing the last wire, both were thoroughly soaked and exhausted, but the fence was solid and secure. Jake tested the tension on each strand, checking the stability of every post. The work would hold through any weather Montana could throw at it. "That should keep your escape artists where they belong," he said, gathering his tools. "I can't thank you enough," Sarah replied, surveying their work with obvious satisfaction. "How much do I owe you for this?" Jake hesitated. The materials and his time were worth at least $200, maybe more given the emergency nature of the job and the weather conditions, but something about the evening had felt different from his usual work. Less like a transaction, and more like he wasn't sure what. "Let's call it 50 for materials," he heard himself saying. "The rest was just neighborly help." Sarah frowned. "That's not nearly enough. You spent hours out here in terrible weather, and this is professional quality work." "It's what feels right," Jake replied, surprising himself with his honesty. As they gathered the remaining tools and headed toward the barn, Jake found himself wondering what the Henderson job would be like after this. Would regular fence work feel mundane after spending an evening working alongside someone who treated him like a partner rather than hired help? The storm was beginning to pass, and through breaks in the clouds, the first stars were becoming visible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for both of them, but tonight they'd accomplished something together that neither could have managed alone. Jake had intended to drive straight to the Henderson place after finishing Sarah's fence, but the storm had other plans. By the time they'd secured all the tools and said their goodbyes, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour that made the county roads treacherous. Sarah had insisted he waited out in her kitchen, offering coffee and a chance to dry off before attempting the drive. Now, 3 hours later, Jake found himself sitting at Sarah's worn wooden table, nursing his second cup of coffee and listening to the storm rage outside. The kitchen was warm and inviting, with copper pots hanging from hooks and family photos clustered on the windowsill. It was the kind of home Jake hadn't experienced since his childhood, before his father's death had set him on his wandering path. "The radio says the storm should pass by midnight," Sarah said, refilling his cup. She'd changed into dry clothes, a soft grey sweater and jeans, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. "You're welcome to stay until then, or..." She hesitated, then continued with obvious embarrassment. "I have a guest room upstairs if you'd rather not drive tonight. The roads get dangerous when they're this wet." Jake studied her face, looking for ulterior motives but finding only genuine concern. In his experience, invitations like this usually came with expectations he wasn't prepared to meet. But Sarah's offer seemed motivated by simple hospitality and practical worry about road conditions. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, "but I've got a job waiting for me at the Henderson place. Told them I'd be there tonight." "Call them," Sarah suggested, nodding toward the phone on the counter. "Jim Henderson's a reasonable man. He'll understand about the weather." Jake found himself dialing the Henderson number, and sure enough, Jim was understanding about the delay. "Hell, Jake," the older rancher said through the phone's static. "I wouldn't send a dog out in this weather. Come by first thing in the morning, and we'll get you set up." As Jake hung up, he caught Sarah smiling slightly. "Told you he'd understand. Jim's been ranching for 40 years. He knows how weather works." The conversation that followed was unlike any Jake had experienced in recent memory. Sarah was easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions about his work without prying into personal territory he wasn't ready to share. She told him about the challenges of learning ranch management on her own, about the neighbors who'd been helpful, and the few who'd made things more difficult. "There's this one guy, Earl Briggs, who owns the spread north of here," Sarah said, her expression darkening. "He's been after me to sell since the day Tom died. Shows up every few weeks with increasingly aggressive offers, telling me I'm in over my head." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd encountered men like Briggs before, predators who circled struggling operations like vultures. "What kind of offers?" "About half what the land's worth, and he knows it. Says I should take what I can get before I lose everything." Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee cup. "The worst part is some days I wonder if he's right. Today was one of those days until you showed up. Because of the fence? Because you saw a problem and fixed it without expecting anything in return. It reminded me that not everyone's looking to take advantage." Sarah met his eyes across the table. "Tom always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated animals and strangers in need. You passed both tests today." Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise, but also strangely warmed by it. Just seemed like the right thing to do. That's exactly what makes it meaningful. Around 11 o'clock, the storm finally began to subside. Jake could hear the rain lessening against the windows, though thunder still rumbled in the distance. He should leave soon, get to his truck and find a motel for the night. Staying longer felt dangerous in ways he couldn't quite articulate, but when Sarah suggested they check on the horses one more time, he found himself agreeing. They pulled on jackets and made their way to the barn through the diminishing rain. The horses were calm and dry, content in their stalls. The barn felt peaceful after the chaos of the storm, filled with the gentle sounds of animals settling for the night. "They look happy," Sarah observed, stroking Bella's neck. "I was so scared when I found them missing. These horses are all I have left of Tom. He picked each one personally, spent months training them." Jake watched her interact with the horses, noting the obvious affection between them. "They're beautiful animals. Your husband had a good eye." "He did." Sarah's voice was soft with memory. "He always said horses could sense the kind of person you really were. That's why he trusted your approach with them today. They don't usually warm up to strangers so quickly." As they walked back toward the house, Jake found himself reluctant to leave. The evening had been unexpectedly pleasant, a reminder of what normal human connection could feel like. But staying longer would mean crossing lines he'd carefully maintained for years. "I should get going," he said as they reached the porch. "Roads should be clear enough now." Sarah nodded, though she looked disappointed. "Of course, thank you again for everything today. I know you had other plans and you gave them up to help me." "Sometimes plans change for good reasons," Jake replied, surprising himself with the admission. "Jake," Sarah called as he reached the steps. "If you're ever in the area again and you need a meal or just want to check on your fence work," she smiled. "You're always welcome here." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "I'll remember that." As he drove away through the clearing night, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in his carefully ordered world. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it would be like to stay in one place long enough to see if connections could grow into something lasting. Behind him, Sarah's house glowed warmly in his rearview mirror, and he carried the memory of her smile all the way to the motel in town. 3 weeks had passed since Jake fixed Sarah's fence, and he'd thought about her every single day. The Henderson job had kept him busy. They'd needed extensive repairs to their cattle fencing after the storm, but his mind kept wandering to Sarah's warm kitchen, her easy laugh, and the way she'd looked at him when she said he'd always be welcome. Jake had driven past her ranch twice on his way to supply runs in town, but he'd resisted the urge to stop. Getting involved with clients was a complication he'd avoided for good reason. His lifestyle didn't accommodate relationships or commitments beyond the next job, yet something about Sarah Mitchell had lodged itself in his thoughts like a splinter he couldn't extract. Now at dawn on a crisp November morning, Jake was driving past her property again when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of horses in distress, high-pitched whinnying carried across the fields, urgent and panicked. Jake immediately pulled over and scanned the pasture where Sarah's 3 horses should have been grazing peacefully. What he saw made his blood run cold. The horses were bunched together near the barn, clearly agitated, and smoke was rising from the direction of the main house. Not the comfortable chimney smoke he remembered, but thick, dark smoke that spoke of real fire. Jake floored the accelerator down the ranch road, his truck kicking up gravel as he raced toward the emergency. As he got closer, he could see flames licking at the back corner of Sarah's house, probably near the kitchen where they'd shared coffee just weeks ago. Sarah's truck was in the driveway, which meant she was likely inside, possibly trapped or overcome by smoke. He parked hastily and ran toward the house, shouting Sarah's name. The front door was unlocked, and he burst inside to find the main room filled with smoke. The acrid smell burned his lungs as he called out again. "Jake?" Sarah's voice came from somewhere deeper in the house, weak and coughing. "Jake, is that you?" He followed her voice to the kitchen, where he found her on the floor beside the stove, conscious but clearly affected by smoke inhalation. The fire had started from what looked like a grease spill that had ignited and spread to the curtains and cabinets. "I tried to put it out," Sarah gasped, as Jake helped her to her feet. "The fire extinguisher, it's empty. I think Tom never replaced it after." "Don't talk," Jake said firmly, supporting her weight as he guided her toward the front door. "We need to get you outside, then I'll deal with the fire." Once Sarah was safely on the front porch, breathing clean air, Jake grabbed the garden hose and began attacking the flames. The fire hadn't spread as far as he'd initially feared, and the morning's dampness from overnight dew had slowed its progress. After 15 minutes of steady work, he managed to extinguish the last of the flames, though the kitchen was badly damaged. Sarah sat on the porch steps, still coughing occasionally, but clearly recovering. When Jake finally joined her, she looked up with tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "If you hadn't come," she began, but Jake shook his head. "But I did come. That's what matters." He sat beside her on the steps, studying her face with concern. "Are you hurt? Do you need to see a doctor?" "I'm okay, I think. Just shaken up." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving clean streaks through the soot. "What were you doing here so early? Not that I'm complaining, you saved my life, but..." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I was driving to town for supplies, heard your horses making noise and saw the smoke." It was true, but not the complete truth. He'd been taking the long way to town specifically because it took him past her ranch, hoping for a glimpse of her going about her morning routine. "The horses," Sarah said suddenly, looking toward the pasture with alarm. "Are they okay?" "They're fine. Scared but safe. Animals have good instincts about danger." Jake paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Sarah, have you had any problems lately? Anyone bothering you?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Earl Briggs stopped by yesterday, made another offer for the ranch, more aggressive than usual. When I refused, he said I was going to regret being stubborn." She met Jake's eyes. "You don't think he would..." "I don't know, but grease fires don't usually happen to careful cooks, and you strike me as someone who's careful in the kitchen." Jake's jaw tightened with anger. "Has he made any direct threats?" "Nothing I could prove. But Jake, even if Earl didn't cause this, he's going to use it as ammunition. He'll say it proves I can't handle ranch life, that I'm a danger to myself and my neighbors." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I should just sell and move on." "Don't." The word came out more forcefully than Jake had intended. "Don't let him win by giving up." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Jake, you barely know me. Why do you care what happens to this place?" It was a fair question, and one Jake had been asking himself for weeks. Why did he care? Why had he been driving past her ranch, hoping for glimpses of her? Why had the thought of her selling to Earl Briggs made him feel like something precious was being lost? "Because," Jake said slowly, "in 25 years of drifting from job to job, I've never met anyone who belonged somewhere the way you belong here. And because," he took a deep breath, deciding to risk honesty, "because 3 weeks ago you reminded me what it felt like to be part of something, instead of just passing through." Sarah's eyes widened at his admission. "Jake, I know I'm just a drifter who fixed your fence," Jake continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay and help you rebuild. Not just the kitchen, everything. Help you make this place strong enough that men like Earl Briggs can't threaten what you've built." For a long moment, Sarah was quiet, studying his face as if trying to read his intentions. Then, slowly, she smiled, the same genuine smile he'd been carrying in his memory for weeks. "I'd like that," she said simply. "I'd like that very much." As the sun climbed higher over the Montana plains, Jake Thompson made a decision that would change the course of his life. For the first time in decades, he was going to stop running and build something lasting, and he was going to do it with a woman who'd shown him that home wasn't just a place, it was the people who made you want to stay. The sound of horses calling peacefully in the morning air carried across the ranch, no longer distressed but welcoming, as if they too understood that something important had changed with the dawn.